The crazy mountains of Montana rise out of the earth like a jagged set of broken teeth. They are isolated. They are steep. They are unforgiving. To the locals, they are simply called the Crazies. It is a name earned through centuries of whispers and a geography that seems designed to swallow the unwary. There is a weight to the air up there, a silence that does not feel peaceful. It feels like the mountains are holding their breath, waiting for you to make a mistake. In September of 2014, Aaron Hedges decided to step into that silence. He was 38 years old. Nothing. He was a father. He was a husband. More importantly, for our purposes, he was an expert. He was a hunter who grew up with the smell of pine in his lungs and the weight of a pack on his back. He was not a novice. He was not a tourist who wandered off a paved trail in flip-flops. Aaron knew what he was doing. And yet, the Crazies took him anyway. It started as a typical elk hunting trip with two friends. They were headed for a high-altitude cache. The air was thin. The terrain was a brutal mix of scree slopes and dense timber. On the way up, Aaron began to struggle. He was falling behind. He told his friends to go on ahead. He said he would take a different route, a shortcut to a lower camp where they had supplies waiting. It was a decision made in the heat of the moment. It was the last time anyone would see him alive. The weather in Montana does not care about your plans. Within hours of Aaron splitting off, a massive storm rolled over the peaks. It brought snow. It brought sleet. It brought a bone-chilling wind that turned sweat into ice. The visibility dropped to nothing. When Aaron did not show up at the camp, the alarm was raised. What followed was one of the most intensive search and rescue operations in the history of the state. Searchers on horseback. Searchers on foot. K-9 teams. Infrared cameras mounted on helicopters. They combed those ridges for days. They looked through every drainage. They checked every thicket. For 7 days, they found absolutely nothing. Not a footprint. Not a discarded wrapper. It was as if Aaron Hedges had simply dissolved into the grey mist of the storm. Then, the anomalies began to surface. And this is where the story stops being a tragedy and starts becoming a nightmare. A year later, miles away from where Aaron was last seen, a search team found a single boot. It was one of Aaron's boots. It was sitting on a high ridge, miles in the wrong direction. To get to that spot, Aaron would have had to hike over some of the most vertical and treacherous terrain in the range. He would have had to do it during a blizzard, and he would have had to do it while bypassing several easier routes to safety. Near the boot, they found his water bladder. It was empty. But here's the detail that keeps investigators up at night. The boot and the bladder were found in an area that had been searched extensively by air and ground teams during the initial disappearance. They were sitting out in the open. How do you miss a bright orange piece of gear in a landscape of grey rock? You don't. It wasn't there during the first week. It appeared later. But the mountains weren't done playing their games. In 2015, a rancher on the other side of the mountains found more of Aaron's gear. A camelback. A pair of binoculars. Again, these items were miles away from the last known point. They were found on a private ranch in an area that made no tactical sense for a lost hunter to visit. To get there, Aaron would have had to cross multiple high-altitude passes. He would have had to travel a distance that would challenge a marathon runner, all while suffering from hypothermia and exhaustion. The final piece of the puzzle was found in 2016, nearly 2 years after he vanished. Aaron's remains were discovered. They were found on that same private ranch, less than half a mile from a well-used road and a ranch house. He was found in a patch of thick brush. The kicker: the ranch owner had searched that exact area multiple times over the previous 2 years. He had moved cattle through there. His dogs had run through those bushes. They had found nothing. Then, suddenly, there he was. The condition of the remains was disturbing. His clothes were scattered. His gear was missing pieces. There was no logic to his path. He had traveled nearly 15 miles as the crow flies, which in the Crazies means he likely hiked closer to 30 miles of vertical gain and loss. He did this in the middle of a winter storm. He did this while losing his equipment, piece by piece. When you look at the map of where Aaron went, it doesn't look like the path of a man trying to survive. It looks like the path of a man who is being driven, or perhaps A man who was being played with. Why would an experienced hunter climb away from the valley floor and toward the jagged peaks during a blizzard? Why would he take off his boots? Why was he found in a location that had been checked a dozen times before? This is the hallmark of the missing 411 pattern. The high altitude. The proximity to water or granite. The impossible distances traveled by someone who should be immobile. The gear found in places it shouldn't be. And the most chilling detail of all? The way the body appears in an area that was previously clear. The Crazies are an ancient place. The Crow tribe used to go there for vision quests. But they warned people not to stay too long. They spoke of things in the shadows. They spoke of the mountains themselves having a will. Aaron Hedges was a strong man. He was a smart man. But in the end, he was just another name added to a list that keeps getting longer. The official report might say exposure. It might say disorientation. But those words are just a veil. They are what we tell ourselves so we can sleep at night. They don't explain the boot on the ridge. They don't explain the 30-mile trek through a wall of white. They don't explain why the mountains decided to give him back only after they were done with him. If you find yourself in the high country, and the wind starts to die down, and the silence gets a little too heavy, don't wait for the storm. Don't trust the shortcut. Because out there, in the places where the maps turn gray, logic is a luxury you cannot afford. The pattern is real. The mountains are hungry. And they are always watching. The rancher stood in the center of that thicket, his breath hitching in the frigid mountain air. And he felt a cold that had nothing to do with the Montana winter. He had been through these specific bushes 50 times in the last 700 days. He had watched his blue heelers dart through this exact patch of chokecherry and serviceberry chasing stray calves. There had been nothing there. No smell of decay. No flash of synthetic fabric. No glint of a steel blade. Then, as if the mountain simply blinked and changed its mind, Aaron Hedges was there. It was as if the earth had exhaled him back into reality. The remains were not a person anymore. They were a puzzle that defied every law of physics and human survival. We talk about the condition of the body in these cases, but we rarely talk about the silence that surrounds it. When they found him, his clothes were scattered in a way that suggested something far more sinister than paradoxical, undressing. Usually, when a man is dying of hypothermia, he sheds his layers because his brain tells him he is burning up. But this was different. Pieces of his gear were missing entirely, while others were found miles away in the opposite direction. Let us look at the timeline, because the numbers do not add up. Aaron vanished in late September of 2014. He was a seasoned hunter. He knew these peaks. He had a pack, a rifle, and the kind of mental fortitude that comes from years of tracking elk in the high country. When the storm hit, he should have bunkered down. He should have descended toward the warmth of the valley floor. Instead, the evidence suggests he began a climb that no sane man would attempt. Searchers later found one of his boots. Just one. It was sitting on a high, wind-swept ridge, miles from where he was last seen. It was not discarded in a scramble. It was not lost in a fall. It was sitting there, upright, as if he had simply stepped out of it and continued into the wall of white with one bare foot. Can you imagine that sensation? The grit of the granite and the bite of the ice against raw skin. And the sheer, driving impulse to keep moving upward. He traveled 15 miles as the crow flies from his last known position. But in the Crazies, a straight line is a myth. To reach the place where he finally stopped, Aaron would have had to navigate nearly 30 miles of vertical ascent and descent. He did this in the middle of a whiteout blizzard. He did this while losing his equipment piece by piece. His water bottle found here. His backpack found miles away there. It is the path of a man who was being hunted. Or perhaps, a man whose internal compass had been shattered by something we do not understand. The experts will tell you about the lore of the high country, how the brain misfires under extreme stress. They will talk about cerebral edema, but they cannot explain the rancher. They cannot explain how a team of professional searchers, equipped with thermal imaging and scent dogs, could miss a human body in a patch of brush for 2 full years, only for it to appear in a spot that had been cleared a dozen times over. This is the recurring nightmare of the missing 411 files. The body that returns to a searched area. It is as if whatever took him was finally finished with the toy and dropped it back where it knew we would eventually find it. The Crow people called these mountains the Awaxaawappia. They believed the peaks were inhabited by the little people. Spirits that could be benevolent but were often incredibly dangerous. They warned that the crazies were a place for vision quests, for fasting and seeking the divine. But they also warned that if you stayed too long, the mountains would take your mind. They spoke of the wind having a voice that could mimic the sound of a friend calling from just over the next ridge. When you look at the map of Aaron Hedges' movement, it is not a survival trek. It is a zigzag of madness. He crossed freezing creeks when he didn't have to. He climbed toward the jagged teeth of the peaks when safety was only a few miles behind him. There is a specific kind of horror in realizing that a man spent his final hours running away from help and toward his own end. The boots are the detail that haunts me. We see this in case after case across the national parks. The shoes are removed. Sometimes they are neatly tucked under a tree miles from the body. Sometimes they are found in the middle of a trail with no tracks leading away from them. Why does the mountain demand the shoes? Why does the pattern always involve this strange, ritualistic shedding of the very things that protect us from the earth? Aaron was found near a source of water, another hallmark of the 411 pattern. These disappearances and discoveries cluster around granite outcroppings and high-altitude lakes. There is something about the chemistry of these places. The way the stone holds the cold. The way the water reflects a sky that feels too close. It is as if these locations are thin spots in the world. Places where a man can slip through the cracks and find himself in a nightmare he cannot wake up from. The official cause of death was exposure. That is a clean word. It is a clinical word. It fits nicely on a death certificate and allows the authorities to close the file. But exposure does not explain why an expert woodsman would walk 30 miles in a circle. It does not explain why the dogs refused to pick up his scent during the initial search. It does not explain the feeling the rancher had, that the body had not been there the day before. As I sit here looking at the photographs of those jagged Montana peaks, I am reminded that we are only guests in the high country. We go there with our GPS units and our Gore-Tex jackets, thinking we have conquered the wild. But the wild does not care about your technology. The crazies are ancient. They have seen civilizations rise and fall, and they have kept their secrets for 10,000 years. Aaron Hedges was not the first to be taken by the shadows of the crazy mountains. And if the pattern holds, he will not be the last. There are others out there. Names on a list. Souls who walked into the trees and simply ceased to be. Until one day, months or years later, they are returned to us in a way that raises more questions than answers. If you ever find yourself on those ridges, and you feel a sudden, inexplicable urge to turn away from the trail, if you hear a voice that sounds like someone you know calling from the deep woods, do not follow it. Do not take off your boots. Because once the mountain decides it wants you, it does not matter how fast you can run. The silence is already waiting. And the pattern is never wrong.